I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your threat. Hello, my name is Will, and this is Exploding Helicopter, the #1 rated podcast about films where helicopters explode. Stanley Donen is best known as the director of classic musicals such as Singing in the Rain, Funny Face, and On the Town. But in the 1960s, he broadened his range by making a pair of Hitchcock-inspired mystery thrillers. The films featured top Hollywood names, glamorous European locations, and racy espionage plots. The first of those films, 1963's Charade, which starred Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant, was a critical and commercial success. So it was no surprise that a few years later, Donen sought to repeat the trick by producing another suspense and romance-filled adventure. And that's the film we're going to be looking at on this show, the 1966 movie Arabesque, which features one of the most unusual methods of helicopter destruction we've yet seen. To help me look over the film, I've called in an old friend of the Exploding Helicopter podcast. So joining me today is Todd Liebenow from the Forgotten Filmcast. Welcome back to the show, Todd.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a little while since you've been on the Exploding Helicopter podcast, and last time you were on, we were looking at a very different sort of film, the Chuck Norris classic Invasion USA. Now, I think at the time you weren't terribly familiar with Mr. Norris's canon of work, but I'm pleased to see that since then you've been continuing your education. How have you enjoyed your further explorations of his work?
Oh, I definitely have. I mean, Chuck Norris is, you got to take his films with a certain frame of mind, I guess. But even the ones that are, not quite stellar, there's certainly something to enjoy with them. And, Chuck is certainly magnetic on screen, so you can't argue with that.
And which of his ones would you say you've particularly enjoyed?
I ended up, I think this came after we did our discussion on Invasion USA. I ended up doing a discussion on my podcast about Code of Silence, which I thought was rather good. Kind of a different style film for Chuck Norris. It's directed by the guy that directed like The Fugitive and such. So it's kind of got a different approach to it. And it takes place in Chicago, which is where I grew up. So that was interesting. But on the level of more, kind of the like Invasion USA films, I a few months back watched The Hero and the Terror, which I kind of had fun with. I mean, it's got the guy that was Jack O'Halloran, who's one of the supervillains in Superman 2, playing the bad guy. So that was a bit of crazy fun.
I think you also watched Breaker Breaker, which I'm particularly interested in for reasons I'm sure you can guess.
Yeah, Breaker Breaker is wild. It's kind of this, you got a truck driver doing kung fu and, it's kind of like mixing the Chuck Norris martial arts trend with the hype over stuff like Smokey and the Bandit, kind of weird.
Yeah, and I think it has a helicopter exploded by somebody driving a articulated lorry through it. So I'm definitely going to have to get round to that film at some point. But you mentioned your own podcast, Forgotten Filmcast, and that's where you like to celebrate movies that time forgot. Would that be a sort of fair way to describe what you do?
Yes. Yeah. I always like to look at those movies that don't get talked about much anymore. It kind of grew out of the fact that I was not getting to the theater very much and sitting around watching what was on Netflix. And back then there was a lot of movies that I'd go through the list on Netflix and I go, well, I've never heard of that. Okay, let's give it a shot. And I figured there's lots of people writing about the new releases. I'm going to write about these movies that don't get talked about anymore. And that kind of went into the podcast and all that. And it's been a lot of fun. It's always great to find those hidden gems and just be able to go, ooh, I've seen this movie that only like 50 people have logged on Letterboxd,
So what would you say is the favorite film you've discovered whilst doing the Forgotten Filmcast?
Oh my gosh, that's a really difficult question.
Throw out a couple if you don't want to choose one.
One that I really enjoyed actually came very early on. I'm getting really close to the 100th episode of the show, but I want to say it was around episode like 12 or 13, something like that. I had a guest on the show, and when I asked him on, he immediately said, can we watch Last Train from Gun Hill, which is Kirk Douglas. It kind of is coming right off the heels of Gunfight at OK Corral. Same filmmakers, same sets in a lot of ways. And I just found it to be a really, really intriguing Western. And that was probably one of my favorites of the early days of watching the show or of doing the podcast. So.
Oh, that sounds interesting, because I'm a big fan of Westerns, big fan of Kirk Douglas, but I haven't actually seen that film. So I think I'm going to go and seek it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I think it's time for us to delve deeply into Arabesque's treasures. So let's see if Trailer Man can explain the formula of this film.
Combine international intrigue with murder and romance, and you'll get Arabesque.
Hello.
Starring Gregory Peck and Sophia Loren.
Don't stop. It feels divine.
Professor Pollock's easygoing lifestyle is about to change.
Let me go.
Good morning, Mr. Pollock.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Bishravi is opposed to our programs and plans some violent exercise of that opposition in the near future. We have to find out what he intends doing and when.
An Egyptology professor, played by Gregory Peck, finds himself at the centre of an international intrigue after he's hired by a mysterious Arab, played by Alan Bedell, to decipher some hieroglyphics. The seemingly innocent code-breaking takes a sinister turn when Bedell's girlfriend, played by Sophia Loren, warns Peck that he'll be murdered as soon as he decodes the message. Fearing for his life, gangly Greg absconds with Loren, only to find himself pursued by Bedell's goons, who want to recapture him and the pharaonic riddle. Now, Exploding Helicopter must confess that that summary scarcely covers the first 20 minutes of this film, but by common consent, Arabesque has a tortuously complicated plot. So, for the sake of brevity, not to mention our own uncertain grip of events, we're not going to say much more about it. Suffice to say that the rest of the film involves lots of double dealing and sinister skullduggery as various groups vie for getting hold of this ancient text and its secrets. The film is generally well regarded. On IMDb, it has a rating of 6.6, while on Rotten Tomatoes it has a critics rating of 64% and an audience rating of 55%. Arabesque did pick up some critical attention from the awards, and the cinematography won a BAFTA, and it was also nominated for costume design and editing. But Todd, this was a first time watch for you. What did you make of Arabesque?
I found it to be a really interesting film. I was pleasantly surprised just then I hadn't heard that it won a BAFTA for its cinematography, and I think that's very well deserved. I think one of the things that stands out most about this movie is its unique visual style. It's got a lot of shots where they are photographing like through items, or we're seeing the reflection of things. You know, our main actors, we're just seeing them through a mirror or reflected through someone's glasses or something like that. I thought that was a really, really interesting approach to things. When I thought about this movie, I thought, well, this is like an accidental James Bond type of film. You know, when you start things off, the opening credit sequence is very much inspired by a James Bond film. And then as things move on, you've got Gregory Peck as this guy who's kind of a, you know, stuffy professor type of guy that kind of falls into this situation. And sometimes he ends up to being quite handy with it. And other times he kind of bumbles his way through it, you know, but I found him to be an interesting character that I enjoyed following through all this. And like you said, it is a complicated plot. I mean, I reached a certain point with this where I just kind of said, well, you know what? Forget it. I'm not going to try to make sense of all this. I'm just going to kind of ride with it. And just looking over the Wikipedia page really quickly here before we got started, I saw that Stanley Donen, actually, someone quotes him as saying something along the lines of his main goal was to make this so visually exciting that the audience wouldn't have time to work out what the hell was going on. And I was like, yeah, I think that definitely happened to me as I was watching this movie. I got definitely caught up in the visuals, some good, decent action sequences there. I didn't end up, you know, really caring a whole lot about the MacGuffin of the movie, which, you know, is fine. That's kind of what's meant to be.
Yeah, and I think you nail a couple of things here with this film. It's definitely a really enjoyable film, but I think you need to basically switch off your critical thinking, suspend your disbelief, because the plot doesn't make a lot of sense, or it's really hard to follow. And having watched this film a couple of times now, I kind of factor that into the equation. And actually, it's kind of gone up a bit in my estimation, because you can kind of rule those aspects of the film out, and you can just kind of get on with enjoying what there is to enjoy enjoying this movie. And as you say, this is a really visually entertaining film. It might feel a little bit gimmicky, but there aren't too many films that kind of go all out stylistically like this.
Right.
So why not just enjoy it? Let's not sort of pick holes in it too much. And you've got a couple of big name Hollywood actors here. This might not be their best work, and this might not be their best film, but it's really entertaining to see, Gregory Peck and Sophia Loren working together on screen.
Yeah, I agree. Jumping back real quick with what you were saying about, the visual style feeling gimmicky at first. I agree. Yeah. The first time you see it, you go, oh, that's cute, but that's a little cheesy. But they stick with it. They keep doing interesting shots. And so I was on board once I realized, okay, that's the approach we're going to have here. As for the actors, yeah, I agree. It's not their best, but it's certainly enjoyable enough. Gregory Peck is one of those actors who, and I admit, I certainly don't have the full exposure to his big film career. I've seen some important things, but there's a lot of holes. But Gregory Peck is one of those guys that when I see him, it's always a little bit hard for him to, shall we say, vanish. He's always Gregory Peck. You know what I mean? But I think that kind of works for him in this because he's meant to be a little bit of a stuffy, stiff back type of guy. He's trying to put up a good front. When he gets put into these situations that are really kind of awkward for him, it works that it's Gregory Peck and he's kind of stumbling around, that's kind of fun. And he's got some good, slightly awkward chemistry with Sophia Loren. I mean, that sequence where she's in the shower and he's hiding is really pretty funny. And I thought, with an actor that was maybe a bit more laid back than Gregory Peck is, it wouldn't work quite as well.
Yeah, because that's one scene that is very, very entertaining in this film. And basically what happens in this scene is that Gregory Peck is trying to have a sort of covert conversation with Sophia Loren. Another character, arrives at the room that they're in. So Peck hides in the shower, and basically Sophia Loren is kind of forced into then sort of getting into the shower. And she's obviously got no clothes on, and Gregory Peck is this, as you were saying, this fusty academic, and so he's starting to feel a bit sort of hot under the collar, as anyone would when you've got a unclothed Sophia Loren in front of you. And reminded me, that type of scene reminded me very much of something that Alfred Hitchcock would have included in one of his films. And Hitchcock is a regular reference point for this film and for Charade, which came out a few years earlier. Do you see the sort of comparisons to his films in this one?
Oh, definitely. And especially, I think the film that you're going to draw the most parallels to is one of my favorite Hitchcock films, and that's North by Northwest. Again, that Peck's character is this accidental hero in this, much in the same way Cary Grant is in North by Northwest. And I think I even read that Grant was the first choice for Stanley Donen to play this part, and you can certainly see where this would fit into the type of roles that Cary Grant played. But yeah, the Hitchcockian elements in this are very clear. Donen definitely takes kind of a different twist on things. He doesn't have the same style that Hitchcock does. But that mix of suspense with some elements of humor is very much in line with what you see in a film like North by Northwest.
I wanted to jump back to some points you were making about Peck's character in this movie. And, you seem to think that it worked quite well. I have to say, I've got a slightly different take on it because, Peck often plays these roles where he's a very straight-laced guy. He's somebody who is often in his movies a figure of moral authority, and here he's playing this sort of peaceable academic, and he's got that's kind of within his range, but he then finds himself caught up in this international intrigue, and he has to engage in this sort of whirlwind romance with Sophia Loren, and at various moments in the film when he's facing sort of life-threatening danger, he's making these insouciant sort of offhand, sarcastic comments. And I have to say, it was at moments like that it was at those particular moments that I felt that Gregory Peck didn't quite work in this role, because he's a bit too sort of straight-laced to sort of be believable as somebody who would be facing danger in quite such a light-hearted way.
I can get behind that. Yeah, there's a few moments where, I mean, if you want to call them joke lines, where he's flat out making a sarcastic comment that, yeah, I can see that it comes across maybe a little bit awkward. But I don't know. I think kind of the way that he is a little bit of a bumbler, shall we say, where he's someone that is trying to put up a good front that he's got it all together. And like I say, he's coming from an academic environment where, he's well respected on all that. And he's thrown into this situation where he is out of his element in a lot of ways. I don't know. That charmed me in certain ways.
Yeah, I can see that, and we've already spoken about how sort of Cary Grant was actually the original choice for this role, and you can definitely see him working in this film. But at the same time, he's got that sort of natural, laid-back style that it may not have worked quite as well, because he would have just sort of skated through this movie, giving off that sort of attitude like, well, I'm coming out of this unscathed, and it would have perhaps removed a little bit of the jeopardy that you need to feel at certain points in the plot of this movie.
I agree, and I think that if it had been Cary Grant, it might have come across more of he's just resting on his laurels, because it's pretty much just going through the North by Northwest thing again here. If it was Cary Grant, I think having it be Gregory Peck kind of puts a different spin on things.
One thing going back, I mean, we've spoken about North by Northwest a couple of times in relation to this film, and I think for me, one of the aspects of the plot here that didn't work for me, and I think is better done in a film like North by Northwest, is this idea of how the everyman character is thrown into the plot. So, in both those films, we have accidental heroes, and in this film, in Arabesque, Peck's motivations aren't really that clear. He's, somebody tries to hire him to decipher these hieroglyphics. He turns them down. Then he's persuaded by the prime minister of this invented country to actually take on this job. And quite why Peck decides to take on the job is never really clear. There's one solitary line to explain it where Peck sort of says, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm a huge admirer of yours.
Right.
But we know, that remark or why he has that opinion is never explained. So you sort of think, well, why is he exposing himself to this sort of life-threatening danger? And I think that sort of does sort of harm the kind of the believability of the plot, especially at the beginning. I think once you get into the film, you kind of, well, we're on for the ride now. But certainly in the first act of the movie, that does kind of, I did bump up against that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, basically, he's just saying, I'm a political fanboy, and we really don't know what is behind that. And I do think that's an area where we could have gotten more out of this prime minister character, who, I thought it was an interesting performance, but I wanted to know a little bit more. Why is this guy so respected? What has he done that's so great for his country? Especially since we have such a wonderfully interesting villain that he's up against. But I think, over time, Peck's primary motivation for being in this situation is Sophia Loren. And again, like I said, who can blame him,
Well, let's talk about Sophia Loren and sort of Gregory Peck a little bit more. And Arabesque was kind of a sequel to Charade, which came out a few years earlier. Well, I say sequel in the sense that it was Stanley Donen basically doing a very similar type of plot of film. And Charade starred Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant, and a big part of the success of that film is the chemistry between the two actors. And Donen had wanted Grant for the lead role in this film, but had been unable to sign him. So we have Gregory Peck instead. What did you make of the sort of the dynamic with him and Sophia Loren? We've already spoken about the kind of the bathroom shower scene. But there's some, there's some other scenes, where they have, where kind of they play together as a couple. I think one scene that did stand out for me in terms of perhaps their chemistry not being the greatest was the introduction of Sophia Loren's character, where Gregory Peck sort of his jaw drops and he just sort of goes, hello, 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 and it just it's just a bit awkward.
It was a little bit awkward. At the same time, I'm kind of going, well, would I do much better if I was with Sophia Loren, because, I mean, come on, gorgeous, gorgeous woman. But I agree. It takes a little time for them to settle into the chemistry, shall we say. I think there are several moments where it is definitely there. I think there may be even a few times in this where Sophia Loren, I mean, it's a fine performance for her. It's not her best. There's maybe a few times where she struggles a little bit, and I think just goes back to, well, I'm Sophia Loren. Look at me. I mean, come on, so I think she skirts by a little bit on that. But there are a few fun moments of kind of playful bickering between Peck and Loren that I think really work. So, yeah, I agree it's awkward in the beginning, but as we move through things, I like that there's always a little bit of doubt as to exactly what side Sophia Loren's character is on. I think that they play off each other well in those moments. There's some good moments that are kind of more of the, shall we say, action sequences that they have together. I mean, like, I really dug them ducking the big swinging wrecking ball type of thing. I thought that was a fun sequence, and they work well together in that. So yeah, it takes a little time for them to kind of get on the same wavelength, but ultimately I do think they get there.
And we should talk about the style of this film, and it's a very self-conscious style that we've got here, and that's apparent from the opening credits, which are very elaborate. There's this psychedelic swirl of colours courtesy of Maurice Binder, who did the titles for many James Bond films. And the opening scene of this movie involves lots of shots using reflective surfaces and framing shots in strange ways. Did that add to the mood of the film, or did it become a distraction for you?
It didn't become a distraction to me. I thought it just helped kind of set this, it kind of reminded me that, this is the 60s and we can kind of get away with a lot of interesting things here, and that directors weren't afraid to maybe take some chances like this. I mean, I was really surprised with that visual style when I saw that it was Stanley Donen. I'm like, this guy did Singin' in the Rain, which I would say is the greatest movie musical of all time. And it's a very, very different approach than something like this. I would have never, if you just shown me the two films and not shown me who directed them, I would have never figured it was directed by the same guy. So I found the unique visuals to be something that really helped keep me engrossed in the film.
I would broadly agree with you. I think for the most part, they are properly committed to this. It's not half-hearted. They really go all out, and that's apparent from the very earliest moments in this film, where you see this character being assassinated in a very unusual way, where he's assassinated by an optician via some eye drops, which is a very peculiar scene, to say the least, but at least tells you exactly the sort of tone that this film is going to be taking. I did think there were a few moments where it did feel like they were trying a little bit too hard with the style. I tell you, the one scene that really didn't work for me is the motorway hallucination scene, where Gregory Peck is drugged and finds himself sort of wandering down a motorway, under the influence of some sort of drug, and starts imagining that he's a matador and sort of waving his jacket at passing cars. That scene, I didn't think it was a particularly good idea, and it did go on a little bit too long in my view.
Yeah, I agree. That one was a little out of left field.
But we do get to see some very sort of unusual action sequences, I guess, in this film. And you've mentioned one already, where they find themselves on a building site, and one of the villains tries to kill off Sophia Loren and Gregory Peck using, I don't know what you call that, a big wrecking ball, waving that around. And there's also a very strange sequence where I don't think I've ever seen heroes in a film threatened with death by combine harvester.
Yeah, or unless it's something like Maximum Overdrive or something like that. I don't remember if they even did that in that movie, but that's kind of what came to mind. Yeah, here come all the farm tools coming to get them. But yeah, again though, when that happened, I was like, okay, this is interesting, and I mean, those machines do look pretty menacing coming after them.
But I mean, I think overall Arabesque is, a really enjoyable film. It does have some problems. I think, some aspects of the plot aren't as they have a few holes in they and it's leaking in various places, but the script does have quite a few witty one-liners in it, and I think if you don't look to poke too many holes in it, it's actually a really good, fun, enjoyable watch.
Well, I keep referencing James Bond, but like with a James Bond movie, many times with those, I just say, forget the plot. I've got the basic idea. Here's the good guy. Here's the girl. Here's the villain, and what they're actually going after eventually doesn't matter. And that's the case with this. I did think there was an interesting twist, though, on the MacGuffin, where we're thinking that it's all about discovering what the message is in the hieroglyphics, and there's actually something else that's hidden there. And I thought that was an interesting little twist on things. But yeah, once we got to that point, I'd pretty much stopped trying to figure out what exactly was going on with all that stuff. I do want to jump back because I found Alan Bell as the villain to be a lot of fun in this. When he first showed up on screen, I went, Peter Sellers? Is that Peter Sellers? But it's not Peter Sellers. Looked like him at first. But I loved his approach to things where he's just so full of himself, and like the moments where his henchmen screw up something, he stands there very calmly and just reaches out and smacks him across the face. Idiot, and he doesn't lose it like crazy, but it's just a quick slap, and then it's moving on to the next thing. For me, he was kind of the unsung hero of this film. I really got caught up in the villain.
Oh yeah, he is. He gives an excellent performance in this film. He's very laid back, and he delivers. He has some great one-liners, and he delivers them in a very sort of louche, droll way, which underplays them, but they're all the more enjoyable for the sort of understated way that he puts them across. But yeah, it's a very charismatic performance from him, and he's aided by the fact that he has a very beautifully toned voice, which who really works hard to convey the villainy of this particular character, because he's very much of the sort of urbane school of villains.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I admit this is an actor that I don't know that I'd really seen in anything else, but I'm intrigued to see what else he's done, because I found him to be very interesting in this.
Well, Exploding Helicopter exists for one reason, and that's to study the many and various ways that helicopters explode. So we're going to turn our attention to that right now. But first of all, we're going to take a quick break. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
MovieMavericks.com, broadcasting current box office breakdowns, movie news and reviews. Now for your hosts, Jason and Trevor.
Hey now, even though we're over 200 episodes deep into the Movie Mavericks podcast, it's still not too late to start listening.
Where every show we give you 10 truths, 20 lies, and a bunch of Hollywood secrets.
It's like existentialism slipping into nihilism.
MovieMavericks.com.
We're back, and now we're going to be looking at the single most important aspect of any film, the exploding helicopter. Now, this is a very interesting chopper fireball for several reasons. Firstly, the method of destruction is very unusual, but also it is one of the oldest exploding helicopters in film history. Only 2 films predate the detonating helicopter in Arabesque. So how does it happen? Well, it occurs as part of the film's big climax. Gregory, Peck and Sophia Loren are being pursued across the countryside by the villainous Bedell. He's aboard a helicopter with some machine gun wielding goons. The helicopter, for those of you who like to know these things, is a Bell 47J Ranger. Our hero's escape takes them to a large iron bridge that is currently undergoing repairs. They run onto the bridge while the baddies take pot shots from the chopper swooping above. Clambering down onto a gangway, Peck finds a ladder that has been left by some maintenance workers, and as the helicopter flies underneath the bridge to make another pass, Greg drops the ladder into the whirlybird's rotor blades. The damaged chopper spins off before crashing into the river below and exploding. So Todd, what did you make of the exploding helicopter action here?
I thought the setup was great, and I admit about, a few seconds, 10, 15, 20 seconds or so before it happens, you can see it coming a mile away. Your brain connects the dots and you go, ooh, I like this, and so he drops that into the helicopter. Ultimately, I'm a little mixed on it. I mean, I like the build up to it. I like the way that it happens. Once that ladder gets stuck in the rotors, though, we have quite a few shots where it's in the cockpit. You don't see as much of the helicopter actually spinning out of control, going down into the water. I mean, I get it. This is, the late 60s. They didn't have quite the technology to do the chopper fireballs like they do nowadays. So I realized they were kind of covering themselves on things. I would have liked to see a bit more of the chopper actually spinning out of control, not as much of the baddies, kind of screaming in the cockpit, But, just the setup of the crash alone, that I think is magical. But, it could have been a little better on the actual execution.
One thing I noticed in the execution, and I've noticed this in a few exploding helicopters, is did you notice on the kind of the sound effects that they were using, that they use that sort of high-pitched whine that you often hear in, say, old war movies when a fighter plane has been shot down towards the ground to sort of crash, and they use that sort of whining sound as the helicopter is spinning down towards the ground. And I just, I don't think it's going to make that sound on a plane. I can get it because of the the aerodynamics of a plane, but a helicopter, I just don't believe that sound, and I don't quite know why they use that sound effect.
Well, like you said, this is one of the earliest recorded exploding helicopters in cinema. So, the sound technicians, they were still learning their way here. They didn't know any better yet.
But just going back to the actual sequence itself and some of the shots that you used, I think you describe it perfectly. They are limited by the special effects of the day, and they do a pretty good job to sort of show the helicopter. But the actual helicopter, when it sort of crashes into the river and explodes, that looked pretty good. They must have dropped something that I don't imagine they dropped a real helicopter, but they must have created some sort of life-size replica and dropped that into the river, and that looked pretty good. And there's a decent explosion, although one aspect of the explosion did sort of puzzle me, that after the main explosion, we do see sort of like some flames that are continuing to burn, but they appear to be burning underneath the water, which I'm not sure is possible with the kind of laws of physics or chemistry.
Yeah, I don't know either, but yeah, I agree that when the chopper hits the water, the actual explosion, pretty decent, but you do kind of got to look at it and say, there was only so much they could do here in the late 60s.
Do you think that dropping a wooden ladder into the rotor blades of a helicopter would have caused that kind of damage? I mean, do we think that those blades would spin so fast that they might just sort of chop up the ladder before it could cause some real damage to the helicopter?
Now, I guess I didn't look at the ladder close enough. Is it wooden? I guess in my mind I assumed it was a metal ladder, but
it's definitely wood.
Okay. Yeah, boy, that is a good question. I mean, you might have just chopped up a bunch of toothpicks here and might not have actually done a bunch of damage, but it's the movies, so anything happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen enough crazy stuff up until this point in the movie that we probably shouldn't start picking holes in how destructive this a wooden ladder can be in this particular situation, but. I think it's probably time to wrap up this episode of the Exploding Helicopter podcast. Todd, as you've been such a good sport, would you like to take a minute to tell people where they can find you online and find the different things that you're involved with in terms of movies?
Oh, sure. I will never turn down the opportunity to promote my stuff. My main blog is called Forgotten Films, and you can find that at forgottenfilmcast.wordpress.com. That's where I post all my reviews. Over there, you'll also find links to my podcast called The Forgotten Filmcast. And then I do have another podcast, which you can also find links to on my main blog, which is called Walt Sent Me. It's all about Disney movies. I co-host that with Kristen Lopez from Journeys in Classic Film. I always say it's about Disney in the grand sense of things, because as many people may or may not realize, Disney has many studios that operate under their name. And there are many movies that they have released over the years that you may not realize are Disney movies. So we cover all of them. So, animated films, the stuff released by Touchstone Pictures, Hollywood Pictures, Marvel, Star Wars, even when they owned Miramax, we cover a bunch of those movies. So, it's a lot of fun kind of covering the big spectrum of Disney movies.
Well, once you're done with checking out all Todd's excellent websites and podcasts, make sure you check out the Exploding Helicopter website, where we've got lots of reviews of films and facts on how helicopters explode in movies. If you like what we do, then don't be shy of telling your friends. We could always use some new listeners. Give us a shout out on social media. Help spread the word about chopper fireballs in films. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep watching the skies for those exploding helicopters.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
May I see your address card, please, sir? Diners Club. I'm afraid I don't recognize you.
We're doing a piece on the Arabic cuisine.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm afraid it's not on my list.
You'll be on mine if you don't get out of the way.
I'm sorry, sir.
Would you care to make a comment on the treaty you intend signing tomorrow?
I fear you've been misinformed, sir. I shall not sign the treaty.
Listen!
Get us through. That man's about to be killed.
I hardly think so, sir. The sea